Welcome to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang. In San Francisco, stocks erasing their gains today. Comments from the Fed that the pandemic will weigh heavily on growth in the second half of the year, dampening investor optimism. Apple, though, defying the odds. The company soaring past $2 trillion in market value, a record for a U.S. company. And just minutes ago, Airbnb announced it has confidentially filed to go public, despite the pandemic bringing travel to a near standstill earlier this year. Meantime, it's another story that's sending shockwaves through Silicon Valley. Later this hour, the former COO of Pinterest, Francoise Brocker, will join me for an exclusive interview after suing the company for gender discrimination. But first, let's talk about Apple. Dan Ives of Wedbush Security joins me now. Obviously, a big day for Apple today. We knew this was coming, Dan, but what's the significance of this $2 trillion milestone?
Yeah, it's a monumental achievement for Apple, and I think it just shows a lot of the skeptics that 3-4 years ago thought the growth was over in Cupertino proved wrong again, especially Apple hitting $2 trillion ahead of Amazon and Microsoft and others. And this is with the super cycle on the horizon around iPhone 12. I still think more bullishness ahead. $600 is our bull case.
Is up the only way to go, though? I mean, we are still facing a lot of economic uncertainty the second half of the year. Customers, consumers not going to necessarily have stimulus checks in their pockets for discretionary spending. What does that mean for iPhone sales?
Well, I think for Apple specifically, and this is factored into iPhone sales for the next 12 to 18 months, they're obviously going to take a hit in this just soft macro backdrop that we're seeing in COVID environment. But I also think there's a new appreciation by investors in terms of that services business. That's going to be $60 billion annual revenue next year. I think that's worth $700 to $750 billion. You look at iPhone sales, right now 350 million iPhones have not been upgraded in 3.5 years. Going into what I believe is a 5G super cycle, I still think this is in the middle innings of the stock of getting re-rated by the street.
So let's talk about the public markets right now. Airbnb just filing to go public. Earlier this year, travel was at a complete standstill. It is still incredibly slow, though they are seeing some rebounding. Is now really the right time for Airbnb to get out of the gate?
Look, it's an interesting time for them to obviously go down this route, especially with what you're seeing in that overall gig economy. I mean, based on our estimates and survey work, we think about 30% of consumers will not get in a ride sharing or stay at Airbnb until a vaccine is found. With that said, there's a strong appetite right now in the market for secular growth stories. And then this is not just across disruptive tech, but across software and other areas. And I think that's what they're feeding into. And you see it. There's an insatiable appetite for unique secular growth stories, with many investors looking in Airbnb.
Now, the argument has been made that Airbnb missed its window to go public and should have gone public perhaps last year, earlier this year, before the pandemic, not necessarily knowing what was to come. But there's been this trend of Silicon Valley companies waiting longer and longer to hit the public markets. Do you think that they can recover from perhaps a miscalculation there?
Look, there's always a double-edged sword in terms of windows, because sometimes as companies get more mature and even some of the forecasting and better understanding some of the business trends, they make sure they don't trip out of their shoelace, first quarter out. I think when you look at Airbnb, obviously this COVID environment, which looks like at least over the next 6 to 12 months, it's going to continue to be, some pretty significant headwinds for the overall industry. I think ultimately it really comes down to an execution story. And I think it's no different what you're seeing even when you look at ride sharing with names like Uber and Lyft. And I think it's also a little bit of a cautionary tale when you look at Uber and Lyft, when they came public, and obviously the major hurdles they had coming out, and it's still Herculean battle going uphill trying to regain street credibility.
All right, Dan Ives of Wedbush Securities, thanks so much for calling in. Good to get your voice today on these two big stories. Meantime, it is perhaps the most high-profile gender discrimination story in Silicon Valley since Susan Fowler and Ellen Pao. Former Pinterest COO Francoise Brocker sued the company last week, claiming she was fired for speaking out about discrimination, paid less than her male peers, and left out of key decisions despite being the #2 executive. Since then, Pinterest has faced an employee walkout and calls for systemic change. Earlier today, Brocker joined me in an exclusive interview to share her story.
I was hired at Pinterest as the first COO, and I was looking forward to being a force of progress and drive change. The companies that cater to women, 70% of the users are actually women, and the ad product was in its infancy. But I realized fairly quickly that while I was given a seat at the table, I had no power, or I was not empowered to use my talent to drive Pinterest forward. And I do think if it happened for someone at my level in tech, it happened to many women across the organization. And I wanted to be able to add a voice to this conversation and explain a little bit my story. And I'm hoping sharing my story start a conversation about what the role of women, and even when they reach the C-level of a company, there is still gender discrimination.
Now, I know you can't speak about specific legal issues, but in a Medium post, you don't hold back. You describe a culture that is demoralizing, secretive, toxic. I'd love to hear in your voice, how did you experience that culture? Tell us what happened to you.
I was not invited to meeting. I was not involved in management decision. You know, for example, I was not even on the IPO roadshow. And I had experience previously at Pinterest being on the IPO roadshow. I felt I was marginalized as a company by men that really didn't value my perspective. And when I tried to raise my voice, instead of being applauded for strong leadership, I was criticized for it. I made it to the table, but I was still expected to conform to gender stereotype and really behave differently than from my male colleague.
Your description of CEO Ben Silverman's leadership is damning. Only men were invited to the meetings where decisions were made, men who were in the in-group. There was constant backstabbing, gossiping. Even though you were the COO and #2, you say the only way you could get things done was by hiding things and saying what you really thought was dangerous. What was it about Ben's leadership that you feel was particularly problematic?
I do think is to rely on the same group of people and do not hearing different voice at the table, or when these different voices are actually coming forward, not listening to them. I think it's really important that people understand that hiring women is actually not enough. Making the place where they can be candid and share their perspective is even more important than just hiring them. And I wanted to make this point because even in 2020, it's still happening.
A Pinterest spokesperson told us in a statement, "We remain committed to advancing our culture to ensure that Pinterest is a place where all of our employees feel included and supported, which is why there's an ongoing independent review regarding our culture, policies, and practices. We're reviewing the complaint filed. Our employees are incredibly important to us, and we take all concerns brought to our attention seriously." Some of the other things you allege is that your vesting schedule was less favorable than your colleagues, you were paid less than men, and yet you drove the company's revenue from $500 million to over $1 billion. Ben fired you, you say, in a 10-minute video call saying that you were not collaborative. What was going through your head and your heart at that time?
It was a shock. And it was, clearly I didn't see it coming, obviously. And if you remember the timing, it was in April when we were all trying to figure out how to really communicate and interact with all our workforce that now is completely distributed because we are on months into COVID situation. So yes, it was a shock. I appreciate the statement of wanting to support women or any actually employees that will come forward, but really the company culture spring from what it does, not what it says. And again, too often people are focusing on hiring the women, but they should look at retention, promotion, and really take a hard look at the culture of them.
Now, to be fair, this is a legal case. We don't know their side of the story yet. And you have worked at many companies. You've had hundreds, thousands of people reporting to you. And I'm sure there were situations where you had to fire someone who was successful somewhere else, but maybe you didn't feel was successful with you or simply wasn't working out. What's different, do you think, in this case?
I think it was very different for anything I experienced before in the previous company I worked with. What I felt is I felt my gender was getting in the way was getting in the way of my performance at Pinterest.
The first part of my conversation there with former Pinterest COO Francoise Brocker. Coming up, the second part of that discussion, the former COO of Pinterest talking to me about the treatment of women in the C-suite and whether Jack Dorsey was a better boss. She used to work at Square. That's next. This is Bloomberg. Oracle's bid for the U.S. operations of TikTok has gotten the backing of President Trump, bolstering the software maker's attempt to derail takeover talks led by rival Microsoft. To discuss, we're joined by Bloomberg Tech's Sarah Friar. So the president, Sarah, didn't specifically say Oracle would be better than Microsoft at owning the TikTok assets, but certainly endorsed Oracle. What exactly did he say?
He said that Oracle is run by a great guy who would be great to TikTok, a good buyer for them. So he didn't specifically say that he prefers Oracle over Microsoft, but he definitely nodded in the direction of Larry Ellison, who is, of course, one of the only open supporters in tech leadership of President Trump. Has been pretty vocal about his support and with his money too. So I think that Trump is sending a very strong signal that he prefers that outcome, even if he doesn't say it directly.
Obviously, we know that Oracle and Larry Ellison, a big fundraiser for the president, held a fundraiser for him back in February. What does this actually mean for the talks with Microsoft? How big a wrench is this in the process?
Listen, this process has always been a political process. It's very unusual. You know, when I heard about Oracle stepping in for this bid, at first I thought there's really no logic to this, and then I thought again, and I thought, well, the logic is the Trump relationship, and I think we're going to see a lot of that. This is Trump trying to get maybe this convinces Microsoft to sweeten their deal. He mentions in his comments that he's expecting a big payout for the Treasury as a result of this deal. So maybe they, are aiming to get more money from whether it's Oracle or Microsoft or whoever comes to the fore for the U.S. government as a result of the deal. And of course, none of this would be happening if Trump didn't put out an executive order saying that he needs TikTok shut down within a few weeks or sold to a U.S. company.
How are the talks with Microsoft going so far?
So far, what we've heard from our sources is that the talks with Microsoft and Oracle are the front runners compared to there have been a lot of suitors knocking on the door for TikTok, at least trying to take a look. And those are the two that are the most serious right now. So, it looks like there is not an official statement from Oracle yet on their interest. Microsoft remains the only bidder that we have heard from officially being interested in TikTok. And I think for both companies, it would be something of a data play. TikTok has a lot of insight into the U.S. users. That's one reason why the U.S. government is concerned about its prominence, but also presents an opportunity for these big cloud data companies to come in and do something with that data, run analytics, gather more intel on trends and customers. And so I think that we see kind of a similar outcome for both of those big established tech companies.
All right, Bloomberg, Sarah Fryer reporting on TikTok for us there. Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us. We'll be right back with more of Bloomberg Technology after this quick break. Well, we're now just 2.5 months away from voters having a say on President Trump's leadership as the Democratic National Convention continues remotely. I spoke with Steve Case, the chair and CEO of Revolution Growth, also the co-founder of AOL, for the Bloomberg New Economy Conversations series On the Front Lines. I got his take on the largely virtual upcoming election and what we can expect leading up to November.
America Online in 1985, only 3% of people were online, and they're online just an hour a week. And now we've moved into a world where our economy is largely operating online. Media communications, such as what you're doing, are operating online, and even elections are being fought largely online. So it has been amazing to watch, and we'll see what happens in the next couple of months. I do think it's an important election. I do think tech policy needs to be front and center. Startup policy needs to be front and center. We need to shift the focus just on the, looking in the rearview mirror at businesses that already exist and look forward to understand what the new opportunities are and make sure we're backing them in a much more inclusive kind of way. So, we'll see what happens with the conventions, both this week with the Democrats, next week with the Republicans. Again, largely virtual conventions, and we'll be really interested to see what happens in an environment where historically there's been a lot of kind of door-to-door canvassing. Obviously, that's less likely to happen, and this election is definitely going to be fought more on the internet, and so it's been amazing to watch that transition.
On that note, Senator Harris has won 3 elections in California. She is a bit closer to Silicon Valley, being from this part of the country. What do you think her selection means for potential tech policy? You and I have talked about the antitrust scrutiny on the big tech companies. What are the implications of her selection for the tech economy?
Well, I think it's helpful that because of her base in California, she does understand the tech policy issues across the whole gamut, privacy, antitrust, a whole bunch of different issues can bring that perspective. And I think connecting that with Vice President Biden, who, given his kind of roots in Scranton, also understands some of the challenges that people are facing in different parts of the country, and I think really will continue to be a real advocate for these rising cities and backing more entrepreneurs doing more interesting things in more places. So I think it is an interesting combination, and she certainly brings a perspective from California, from Silicon Valley, that is helpful. But I think the conversation needs to be a little bit less about what's happening in Silicon Valley, a little bit more about what's happening in other parts of the country, and hopefully that will happen. Hopefully more and more of these cities will rise, and more of the Fortune 500 companies of tomorrow will be launched in cities all across the country, not just in a few places on the coast.
Now, last question, Steve. As you look ahead, do you see a vaccine or some sort of silver bullet treatment as the only way out of this? And how do you plan for the next 12 months to 18 months, not knowing if we're going to have that?
Well, it sounds like the momentum around the vaccine has been remarkable, and it's certainly going to be something done much faster. I think the previous record was 4 years. Clearly, it's going to happen, soon, maybe even the next few months. But that's really the first step. The second step is actually, once you decide there is a vaccine that works, how do you distribute it and how do you encourage people to take it? I think that's going to take some time. There's a big anti-vaccine movement in this country. Some people are going to resist that. And there's huge distribution challenges to actually get hundreds of millions of people vaccinated, even if everybody wanted to be. So I think that's where, it's going to focus next year in terms of not just having a vaccine, but broadly distributing, deploying vaccines. So I think it's going to take some time before we get back to normal. But as I said before, hopefully we'll do better than normal and end up with an economy that's even stronger than when this kicked off. But there clearly are going to be some challenges. I think it's going to be a situation where it's sometimes 2 steps forward and 1 step back. We all have to take the long view of this and make sure we're making the decisions to deal with the immediate crises of the moment, of which many companies are facing many of them, but also are looking at where when we do come out of this, how do we end up even stronger than when we started. I think it's an important election. I've always tried to stay out of politics and focus on policy and work in a bipartisan way to get things done, including things like the Jobs Act that passed with broad bipartisan support about eight years ago, Opportunity Zones that passed a couple of years ago. But I think this is a critical election. Clearly, there's a lot of things that are happening in our country and happening around the world.
Steve Case there, the CEO of Revolution Growth. And some breaking news to tell you about: Intel shares spiking after hours after announcing a $10 billion buyback. This is part of a planned $20 billion in share repurchases. So not unexpected, but Intel shares still up on this news. All right, coming up, the second part of my conversation with Françoise Brocker, the former COO of Pinterest, about the treatment of women in the C-suite and whether she thinks Jack Dorsey was a better boss. She also worked at Square, but last week sued Pinterest for gender discrimination. That's next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. It is rare to hear women in the C-suite go public about negative experiences at the top because they often carry the extra burden of feeling a need to protect the company. That is why Françoise Brocker's lawsuit has shaken Silicon Valley. The former Pinterest COO sued the company last week for gender discrimination. In the second part of our conversation, we talked about why we don't hear more women in her position share their stories. Take a listen.
Discrimination at the C-suite level is different. Like, it's not like, hey, grab me coffee. Like, I didn't have this type of conversation. It's much more insidious at the executive level. And the way women are pushed up by men is different. I talk about the glass ceiling and so that I said, oh, I've broken it. I have achieved. I'm a good role model. But at the senior level, it's happening behind your back, and it's undermining you at every step of the way you try to lead. And it's hard to recognize, especially there is this false sense of women at this level are not vulnerable because of their power. But my story is clear an example that this is not true.
Now, this is the same week that the Democratic Party is trying to position itself as the best place for women working or otherwise. We're coming into a critical election, and your story is now more important than ever. How much of an influence did the political environment and President Trump being in the White House have on your decision to come forward?
Of course, I have my personal conviction. And of course, I want more women in power, whether it's in the political system or in companies. So as is, I will completely support seeing more women in position of power, and actually that are able to make decision and take action. And I encourage this across the board. But this has nothing to do about Mr. Trump.
The irony is that 70% of Pinterest users are women. Do you think if Pinterest had more women at the table, more women in decision-making roles, that the product would be better, that they would be making more money?
I think the product could be better. It could be more inclusive. I know Pinterest is working on it. Every company, it's not just Pinterest, every company, there is a ton of study and research that you can find when you have a much more inclusive and diverse workforce. And then when you are able to hear all these different voices, actually the outcome is always better.
You worked at Google for many years, and you were also on Jack Dorsey's executive team at Square, and Jack had a lot of women reporting to him at that time. Was Jack a different leader than Ben, and how so?
I'm very glad you recognize this because not a lot of people notice this, but Jack Dorsey is an incredibly proponent of women in the C-suite. And my gender was never in question. In fact, I actually think one of his superpower is this ability to actually abstract the idea from the messenger, and that is very powerful.
Ellen Pao, who famously sued Kleiner Perkins for gender discrimination, didn't settle her case. They went all the way to trial, and we heard Kleiner's side of the story, and I know it was very public, and she's told me it was very painful for her, and Kleiner ultimately won that case. Are you open to settling, or do you want to and plan to take this all the way, knowing how hard it will be?
So I know how hard it would be, and I know how hard it was for Ellen Pao to come forward. There is two parties in this decision. I'm very confident in the case I have right now.
Now, I spent over 2 years speaking to women, writing a book called Brotopia about the experience of women in Silicon Valley. And at that time, it was a Pinterest employee, Francoise Tracy Cho, who had really put the pressure on the industry to release their numbers. And even though she was doing that personally, it sort of put a halo around Pinterest. Now you have employees staging a virtual walkout, protesting systemic discrimination. You say that discrimination there is rampant. Who else is this affecting?
I think it's affecting the people at Pinterest first. They are very hardworking employees. They came to Pinterest like I did because they were inspired by the mission of Pinterest. They are inspired by the audience of Pinterest, and they want to see change. And I think that's very important.
Now, there are two Black women, Ifeoma Ozama and Erica Shimizu Banks, who recently went public about negative experiences and claims of racial discrimination, including unfair pay, retaliation. How big a problem do you think racial discrimination is in particular at the company?
First, I want to recognize both Ifeoma and Erica. They were the first one that came forward. They gave me the courage also to tell my story. And I have no reason not to think that what they mentioned, I did have a different experience. We are at a different level, and I'm actually not African American. But what they experienced was not, from what I can read, was racial discrimination. And I totally support them.
You say in your Medium post that at times you felt yourself, you were complicit, that you didn't speak up enough for others who were having problems, and you actually apologized for that. And I found that really intriguing. How do you think you could have done better? And is there a lesson in that for other women who might be feeling the same thing in a position of power or somewhat a position of power at their own companies?
I know, and I think that's what is interesting is when you are in this position of power, you think, okay, I made it, you should be able to make it. And sometimes you say, okay, let me try to help you. or find a new way, but it was not enough. I realize this now.
Pinterest did just announce their first Black board member, a Black woman named Andrea Wisholm, president of the real estate company Skywalker Holdings. Do you think that'll change things?
I'm glad they have wanted actually women of color to the board. I think it's good. My question for Pinterest is she going to be empowered to implement some of the ideas she has? And I want to see action.
Speaking of action, you've got a lot of recommendations about what companies and people can do differently. If you could say one thing to CEOs and boards about what they can and should be doing to make sure this isn't happening in their workplace, what would it be?
Just not hire, like cultivate these women, hear them, retain, promote. I've never seen a case of a woman that is over-promoted.
So what's next for you, Françoise? Will we see you in the C-suite again?
Right now, I'm very focused on this issue. I really want to add my voice to many women and underrepresented people, that they get a seat at the table and they feel empowered to actually make decisions and change things. So that's my focus. Where it leads me, I don't know yet. I will see.
Former Pinterest COO Françoise Brocker there. Well, President Trump has frequently criticized the pricing agreement between Amazon and the U.S. Postal Service, saying it is due to the losses that the Postal Service takes on package deliveries. Yet others say the deal with Amazon actually is lucrative for one of the government's oldest operating agencies. With us to break it down, our tech lobbying reporter Ben Brody with Bloomberg News. Ben, thank you so much for joining us. So Trump says Amazon is the post office's biggest problem. Is that true?
No, it does not appear to be true. The biggest problem for the post office is that we all spend all day emailing each other and calling each other on our cell phones. They also have pretty extensive obligations for employee retirement, for funding employee pensions and health care and things like that under the law. And that's really the problem that they are facing. In general, packages are competitive, and they have to cover their costs in that line actually under the law. And so that service is actually just doing fine.
So talk to us then about how you see this playing out. Obviously, the president has made this now a campaign issue. There have been issues with the post office removing letterboxes, which is quite routine, but also has a potentially dramatic impact on the ability for people to mail in their ballots.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this has appeared to a lot of Democrats to be pretty flagrantly political, that Trump may be attempting to use the post office and his postmaster general, who has sort of laid out some of these cutbacks, to basically stop Democratic votes for Joe Biden from being counted in November, which is why he's pushing back and saying, no, I'm actually trying to fix things. Amazon is the real problem. And he loves to blame Amazon and Jeff Bezos. You did have the Postmaster General come out yesterday and say that he was going to walk back some of those service cuts and basically put it off until after the election so that it wouldn't be in doubt. He's going to be here in Washington, or at least testifying remotely on that issue, and we'll see how much farther Congress can push it.
Talk to us about the financial situation of the post office. Is the USPS failing?
It's absolutely losing billions every year. There's absolutely no question about that. Liberals, of course, would argue that that's what a government agency does. We don't say that the military loses the amount of money. We say that it spends it, that it uses it. I think there's an important distinction that we have to make here. There are those letters that I talked about where stamps simply don't cover costs, and that's a lot of the reason that you have these billions of dollars in losses. The government granted monopoly, and they basically don't charge enough. Packages are different. We have FedEx, we have we have UPS, and by law, the Postal Service has to cover its costs. It has to charge competitive rates. And that's a lot of the pushback that you get when you go to either the Postal Service or to Amazon and ask them about this particular contract. The details are confidential, but they will point out to you, well, we can't lose money. It would be illegal.
Is this an issue that resonates with voters? It's certainly a horse he has been beating for quite some time now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it clearly resonates with Trump. He's had a lot of different iterations of attacks against Jeff Bezos. He's had the Postal Service. He's had the Washington Post, which, of course, Jeff Bezos also owns and has a very contentious relationship with the Trump administration. He's had the cloud contract. He's dabbled a little bit in antitrust. So in some ways, it clearly really resonates with Trump. The question about whether it resonates with voters, you actually have the Postal Service is actually pretty popular, and particularly in rural areas and among older voters, they really see that as their lifeline. They may not be as comfortable with email, or the post office may really be the only service that can get goods to them reliably, and so it's incredibly popular, and it's not necessarily politically advantageous for Trump to be poking at them.
All right, Ben Brody, Bloomberg there. Thank you so much, Ben, for that update. Certainly a conversation will continue to follow. Coming up, with the world desperate to find a COVID-19 vaccine, hackers locked down several servers used by researchers at the University of California, San Francisco, and wanted a $3 million ransom in return for the keys. Details on the negotiations next. This is Bloomberg. Universities, hospitals, and labs have become high-value targets for hackers during the COVID-19 crisis, given their access to data on potential new treatments or vaccines. In early June, a group of hackers with a history of targeting healthcare organizations executed a successful ransomware attack on the University of California, San Francisco. Transcripts reveal the university's week-long negotiation to free its servers. Here with the story, Bloomberg cybersecurity reporter Kartikeya Mehrotra. Kartikeya, tell us more about what's happening here.
All right. So in that first week of June, University of California, San Francisco, which is a heralded medical school and teaching hospital, they were researching hydroxychloroquine merits. They were exploring contact tracing tools. They were looking into various demographics and how they've been impacted by the disease. And as they were doing this research, in that first week of June, a gang of Russian or Eastern European cyber attackers locked up 7 servers in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. And what followed was a negotiation between the group who managed what was basically like a customer service portal and the university's third-party negotiator, who were working to find a solution to unlock the servers, which included this very critical data. It was a very fascinating exchange, largely because you had these two dueling ideological parties. You had this very sophisticated university armed with lawyers and consultants and cybersecurity experts, sort of beholden to these hackers. They were the ones with the power. And so what transpired was this back and forth over who really was in control and how to get out of the situation with both parties happy.
So what exactly did they actually steal?
Yeah, so it's unclear because we didn't actually get to click through the files, but the file names included references to COVID research and the CDC. They also had files relating to faculty and professors in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics and students in the medical program, potential applicants. It was data that was important enough to UCSF for them to engage in negotiations with these criminals. So what was most interesting was that, in a typical kidnapping where we're talking about actual people in a hostage crisis, you rarely think that the criminals have leverage and that they're actually going to get away with it. But in the realm of a cyber attack, it's the complete opposite, right? These hackers are behind VPN protections, far away from federal investigators in the U.S. and are more than likely going to get away with whatever it is that they're doing. And so the victims here really had to play ball and legitimize this business model of theirs and say, look, we know you are credible attackers. We've read about you on the internet. You're really smart. We want to work with you. We know you mean us no harm. They treated them like they were business partners. And so over the course of a week, it was a lot of this pandering to them, and the operator, as he or she was so dubbed on the attacker side, was almost like a used car salesman, coming back with offers, going back to his boss to see if this was legitimate, and often just needing that sort of reassurance that he or she was legitimate and that he was going to get paid.
Now, talk to us about the broader threat landscape here, because the DOJ has charged Chinese hackers with trying to hack similar kinds of information. There are other countries behind hack attacks on COVID-19 research as well.
Western intelligence broadly is focused on this very real problem. That is Chinese, Russian, Korean, Iranian hackers looking for IP or intel on what the UK NHS or what American research entities are doing to find a cure. How far along are they compared to their own research institutes, and are they close to finding something that's worthy of being stolen and possibly sold on the dark web, which would make a lot of money, or simply to bolster their own research? Since the U.S. really was infected in late February, early March, the uptick in these kinds of attacks on institutions that are doing this kind of research, including major pharmaceutical companies, biotech firms, and hospitals and medical schools like UCSF, has skyrocketed. And that's been a massive boon to attackers like NetWalker, this group that attacked UCSF. They are making money like they haven't ever before in the past, and this has truly provided an opportunity for them.
Now, Carnegie, there is a question here of why should this necessarily be privileged information? Don't we want everyone in the world to have access to a vaccine?
Absolutely, but I think during research, right, when we're not quite there, entities explore a lot of possible options that don't necessarily need to be distributed widely. UCSF was exploring the merits of hydroxychloroquine, which there's competing research that says that is actually dangerous or not healthy to consume if you're suffering from the coronavirus. So, I think most UCSF particularly do issue statements and releases about the progress that they're making on their vaccine, but hacking into their data set to understand how far along they are, who's working on it, and exposing personal data is a realm that probably stretches well beyond transparency and public knowledge.
Carter Kay, we are standing by now actually for the president to take the podium at the White House in one of his daily news briefings. It was supposed to start at the top of the hour. Now we hear almost at the top of the next hour, but we did just get the 2-minute warning. So the president could potentially be out any minute. Sometimes it's much longer than 2 minutes. But obviously this is something that the president has taken a hard line on. Talk to us about the political implications here of vaccine development, given that, on one hand, you have so many scientists from all different countries around the world collaborating more than they ever have before to get a vaccine quickly, and you also have countries working against each other.
Absolutely. So this is part of a broader geopolitical battle between the U.S. and especially China, right? We've seen this indictment in the last couple weeks where individuals from China were named and have been charged with the theft of proprietary data. This is not just about the vaccine. It's about control over who benefits from it and who gets to control its distribution. This is very much part of an intelligence war and the trade war, and so UCSF may have simply been a case of opportunity where a hacker got in and happened to be able to make money off of COVID research.
Okay,
But,
Kardike, the president has come out. We're going to listen in. Thanks so much.
Before I provide an update on our continued progress against the China virus, I'd like to discuss our latest actions against the Iranian regime. Today, I'm directing the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, to notify the UN Security Council that the United States intends to restore virtually all of the previously suspended United Nations sanctions on Iran. It's a snapback, not uncommon. 2 years ago, I withdrew the United States from the disastrous Iran nuclear deal, which was a product of the Obama-Biden foreign policy failure, a failure like few people have seen in terms of the amount of money we paid for absolutely nothing and a short-term deal. This deal funneled tens of billions of dollars to Iran, 150 billion to be exact, plus 1.8 billion in cash, which I don't know that the president had the authority to give, but gave 1.8 billion in cash. Just another great deal that turned out to be a total disaster that would have funded all of the chaos and the bloodshed and the terror in the region and all throughout the world. And I won't say anything because I don't like saying it, but Iran doesn't have so much money to give to the world anymore, to the terrorists, to give to Al-Qaeda and various other groups of people that they were funding. They have to keep their own regime together, and it's not easy for them. And if and when I win the election, within the first month, Iran will come to us, and they are going to be asking for a deal so quickly because they are doing very poorly. But that deal was a disaster. $150 billion, $1.8 billion in cash. And we got nothing except a short-term little deal. A short-term, expiring. It's starting to expire already. It's terminated, but it would have, if we didn't terminate it, start to expire very shortly. A good deal was the deal we made with UAE and Israel. And by the way, other countries, I will tell you now, want to come into that deal. Countries that you wouldn't even believe want to come into that deal. And all of a sudden, you're going to have peace in the Middle East. And you couldn't have done it with this ridiculous Iran nuclear deal, as they call it, that President Obama made, along with Sleepy Joe Biden. I imposed the toughest ever sanctions on Iran. And this has caused great difficulty for them, giving money to terrorist organizations. And if they do, they'll have hell to pay. Earlier this year, I ordered the strike that took out the world's #1 terrorist, Qasem Soleimani, in addition to previously terminating leader and founder of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the two leading terrorists by far in the world, the founder of ISIS. Nobody even talks about that. And we also defeated, we now have 100% of the ISIS caliphate in Syria. When I took over, it was a mess. It was a total mess. They were all over the place. My administration will not allow this Iran nuclear situation to go on. They will never have a nuclear weapon. Iran will never have, mark it down, Iran will never have a nuclear weapon. When the United States entered into the Iran deal, it was clear that the United States would always have the right to restore the UN sanctions that will prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. We paid a fortune for a failed concept and a failed policy, a policy that would have made it impossible to have peace in the Middle East. Here at home, through Operation Legend, we are confronting the wave of crime in Democrat-run American cities. That's absolutely shocking. When you look at Portland or New York, San Francisco, Seattle, Chicago, sometimes Los Angeles, Democrat-run cities, they're a mess because they don't get it. Either they don't get it or there's something that nobody else understands. We've deployed more than 1,000 additional federal agents to help these Democrat-run disasters. We just have done this. We have to give them a hand. And we can stop it immediately, like Portland would be so easy to stop. We'd stop it immediately. We only sent in some Homeland people who are great, by the way, to save the courthouse because it would have been blown up or burned down. And they did that very easily. But if we were called upon, we would send in, whether it's Homeland, whether it's FBI, whether it's just law enforcement, and we'd send them in quickly. We would eradicate it just like happened in Minneapolis. As soon as they were called in, they should have been called in a lot sooner. You would have had far less damage. Today we announced that Operation Legend has successfully resulted in nearly 1,500 arrests already. Bad ones, really bad people. Prosecutions and prison sentences will follow, and they'll be a very long time in prison for what they've done to these cities. Most cities are well run, most of the nation is well run, and the areas that we're talking about are all, in all cases, run by Democrats, usually radical left-leaning Democrats, like in New York or in Portland. We've made arrests in Kansas City, Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Milwaukee, St. Louis, Memphis, and Albuquerque for many violent crimes, including gun crimes, arson, and 91 murders. We're also using the full power of the federal government.